It's a great honour to do the Lawrence Dana Pinkham Lecture. I'm actually a director or trustee of the Columbia Journalism Review. And I think, I just checked in my diary, I think today was meant to be the board meeting, which sadly I had to miss. And I used India as an excuse, but I now feel as if it's somewhat justified. I'd like to thank Sashi and Ram and the Dean and all the people here who've asked me to come and their huge hospitality today. I'd also like to thank my colleagues Cherian and Arijit, who had the dubious pleasure of trying to recover my luggage from Delhi, from Mumbai, where I left it. I'm incredibly proud, actually, to be here on behalf of Bloomberg in this place because of all the work that the Bloomberg Media Initiative does. We now help to teach journalism in 5 countries in Africa, in India, in Saudi Arabia, as well as in Britain and America, all places where it is needed. And I'm very proud of our connection that we have with you here. I went to go visit the college today, and that again brings me to the main point, is I'm very proud of all the people I met today. I think when you saw it, you had an element of real enthusiasm, of humour, and of the kind of diligence that I suspect you will need in the difficult world of journalism that lies before you. I'm particularly proud of the 3 Bloomberg interns that we've got, who are obviously the foremost and best of them, unlike those who've gone to Reuters. But, and I'm also very proud of the ones who are coming to Bloomberg Quint. I cannot say how much and how crucial what Enran particularly spoke about, but also the winner of the prize of Colgate, that the need for factual journalism, the need for investigative journalism, not just in India, but around the world, but I would argue, especially in India at the moment, is incredibly important. And you only have to look at the winner of that award and the work she did, and also at the people on this stage, what Nalita did, look what Ram did, both in terms of chasing one government with the Beaufort scandal and chasing another one with the Raphael one. Not a scandal yet, just an investigation, to see that it is possible to do this. And I think we all have a responsibility to do that, to look at different ways in which journalism can hold power to account. I looked at Mr. Gandhi's grandfather was originally a journalist, at least briefly, and the title of his autobiography, Experiments with Truth, strikes me as a reasonable way with which journalists should approach their subjects. We have, as Ran said, to re-establish our credentials, and you, all of you, I think, are in a position to be able to start to do that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk a bit about the interaction between news and technology, and then I'm going to come back to the issues of fake news and of the challenges that journalists face at the moment. I'm choosing technology because it strikes me that that is the thing which journalists are most worried about, with the possible exception of some governments at the moment. And it strikes me that when you talk about technology and journalism, it pays to be humble. I am a good exponent of that. Back at The Economist, as it was mentioned, I was that magazine's editor. In 2006, we published a cover which was written like a ransom demand, and whose title was, Who Killed the Newspaper? And it became a staple of media conferences around the world. Whenever people wanted to talk about the way that advertising had gone from print newspapers to online, they would use that. So when, sadly, newspapers began to go bankrupt, I at least had the condolence, compensation of feeling that I had been mildly prophetic about it. But was it actually fair? Just 2 weeks after I became editor of The Economist, a small company called Twitter was set up. It's now arguably the world's biggest daily newspaper. It has 400 million people going to it. Or look around at the quality press nowadays. The New York Times just announced it has 3 million digital subscribers and is aiming for 10. Looking back now, I would argue that the problem was not something to do with journalism, and it was not to do with the internet. It was just another technology that came along. It was the suicidal way that our industry responded to the internet, and especially our embrace insane of giving away content for free. Now that is being reversed, and you can see us and all our competitors, the Wall Street Journal, the Financial Times, the Washington Post, they are all expanding again because they are getting money from charging people. So my point to begin with is that technology has always changed journalism, and not always for the worse. That seems relevant now that a new spectre is haunting our industry, and that's artificial intelligence. And I think there are two basic fears. The first fear is that journalists, all of you if you like, are going to be replaced by robots. And the second is that quality will go down as fake news proliferates and consumers gather in ghettos of like-minded thought. Now, I don't think that's true. Yes, some jobs will be automated, but others, perhaps more, will be created. And journalism, I think, will get more interesting and better. As for fake news, yes, journalism will get more personalized, but not always in a bad way. And yes, we will still sometimes be hoodwinked by fraudsters and by autocrats. But to be honest, that has always happened. In general, I think AI will help deliver a world where we get more information and more truth. But first, I think we need to be fairly precise about what is actually happening in newsrooms around the world, which I think is a lot more than most people realize. And here I'm going to make no apologies for using Bloomberg a bit. There are lots of news organizations, and I will try to pay tribute to them as I go through, who are doing some of the things that I talk about. But the whole thing, I think we tend to be doing slightly more than most. That's partly a function of size. We have 2,700 journalists at Bloomberg, an array of platforms that go all the way from TikTok on Twitter to the terminal. It's partly also because we're a technology company. We have 5,000 engineers working on technology, perhaps 200 of them working on AI and news. And it's partly, finally, because news is unbelievably valuable to us as somebody who feeds news towards the financial markets. If you want an example, and it, needless to say, comes from just before when I arrived at Bloomberg, it came when the Swiss central bank, which used to have its currency, the Swiss franc, pegged to the euro, suddenly decided to drop that peg and set the Swiss franc free. What happened was our reporter in the Zurich office of the Bloomberg saw that and wrote a story immediately saying this had happened. Sadly, our opposite number at our main rival, which remains nameless, happened to be on the loo at the same time. So according to legend, by the time the other guy had returned from the loo, around $1 trillion had changed hands as the Swiss franc rose by 30%. Now you can draw various lessons from that. One of those might be never take a bathroom break. But the second one is that news is unusually valuable if you deliver it to the financial markets. Now I think there are 4 areas where this new technology, where artificial intelligence is changing journalism. The first has to do with the automation of repeatable events. Here I'm going to use the example of an earnings report. When I first arrived at Bloomberg 4.5 years ago, there was a team of young people, quite similar to some of the ones I met earlier today, a group of nimble-fingered, mainly youthful journalists whose speciality was being able to write headlines the moment a company reported things. The moment a company like Tata or Apple or GM announced its results, this team would jump on it and immediately transmit things within a few seconds, again hoping to get the results out before our competitors. And then shortly afterwards, say 30 minutes, a beat reporter, the man who covered Tata or the woman who covered Tata, would come in and write a secondary story summing up the whole picture, taking all the results and making it come together. Tata's sales rose outside India, Jaguar Land Rover did well, costs were down, that type of story. It was basically an analysis of numbers with typically a quotation at the bottom from a stock market analyst. So that was how it was. Now what happens is a technology called Cyborg, perhaps an unfortunate name, but all the same, Cyborg scrapes the earnings from Tata's website, and it spits out headlines, and then within minutes, certainly within a minute, so usually within seconds, it can spit out a bullet-pointed story which contains most of the things that somebody used to write about after 30 minutes, minus, of course, the quotation from the analysts. And the computer keeps on looking for more. It no longer just looks for revenues and profits and what the earnings were last year. It begins to look for what we call secondary data, the numbers of Land Rover discoveries sold in China, and those sort of things which nowadays move markets even more. Roughly 30% of all the things that we do at Bloomberg include some element of automation. But it is really worth stressing the use of that word some, because we need journalists at the beginning to tell the computer where to look. You need to tell them what matters at Tata, to set the templates in the right place so the computer begins to look for the right things. We also need humans to double check what comes out, both for accuracy and also for surprises. The shares of Tata might jump one way or the other because somebody senior resigned and nothing to do with this particular piece of news. Rather than the machines replacing humans, it tends to be humans and machines working together. And the main gain so far has come in the breadth of the number of companies we can cover at the same time. What about that beat reporter, the man or woman who had to write up the story? Well, the interesting thing about that is it ups the ante. You can no longer just list the numbers and pretend you've done a story. You now have to try and say what this means. You have to be able to say, look, the reason why Tata's sales went down was because something has gone wrong with its China strategy, or something has gone wrong with Brexit, or whatever you happen to choose on. You have to use your sources to say what exactly is happening inside the company, and you have to also come up with some idea about what's going to happen next. You have to say what this means. And in financial journalism, I think this will change many things, and it will change things in other parts of journalism. In financial journalism, it tends to be a bit of an arms race. We're spending money on computers, so are otherwise. But you can actually look, you can see automation creeping into other parts of journalism. We had a piece the other day about a very small newspaper on the south coast of Britain, which uses computers to pull information about weather and about traffic from the local government computers and automatically publish things that people can to pick up. And I think the same is true if you look at the coverage of cricket nowadays. You see all the facts and statistics which come out, how close a cricket ball is to the wicket, which soccer player has run the furthest, and that by itself becomes part of the way that people begin to tell their stories. The second area where AI is changing journalism is to do with the craft of journalism. This sounds rather small, but I'm sure that to the people who are graduating today, it will save a lot of time, which those of us who are slightly older may have wasted. Now, at the moment, if you go and record an interview, you usually have to go back and spend the tedious business of transcribing it. But increasingly with voice recognition technology, you'll just put it straight through that, and you'll get given an immediate thing. Or in our business, our reporters have to listen to briefing calls from CEOs. Now a computer can listen to several briefing calls and look out for particular words that can somehow trigger stories of one or another. The biggest game changer, perhaps in a market like this, could be automatic translation. In many places, including India, people often report in one language but write in another. Now the machine can translate. In Turkey, for instance, our reporters break news in whatever language they want to, and then let the computer do most of the translation. Again, I say mostly because you need to keep humans in the process. But if you give a story first to a machine to translate, it can increasingly do so with ever greater accuracy. And I know there may be people in this room who believe that the machines often get it wrong. They do. There's always a time where the first time you talk about the ties between China and India, and the machine translates it as ties like this. But the second time, it learns. And by the third time, it's got better. And yes, some languages are difficult, including Hindi and Tamil. But what happens is other languages is easier. So for instance, we can now do from Spanish to English by machine. It's harder to do English to Mandarin or to Korean, but you can translate from English to Mandarin and then Mandarin to Korean. Everything, in some ways, is moving in that direction. To me, it is like a train coming down the tunnel towards us. These are all things that will help us push forward and will make the craft of journalism easier. It may even make a difference to how people hire people You may end up now hiring the best local reporters in local language and then look for ways in which that can be translated. The third area where artificial intelligence is changing journalism is what I would call signaling. Here the machine finds something, it scours, and it finds something which is interesting, and it asks you, do you want to write a story about it? For instance, at Bloomberg we have a unit called Social Velocity, and that features a relatively small number of journalists and a relatively large number of computers. And what they do is they scour social media all over the world looking for particular words. And I apologize for the grisly nature of this, but disaster, explosion, resignation, shooting. And when they find something, they then say to the journalists, has something happened? And go and look at it. Again, this is a work in progress, but you can already see the results. We used it with the Colombo attacks recently. And it does give you a very clear advantage, but it does rely enormously on you knowing exactly who to trust, because you can spot that something is happening really quite quickly from all the tweets and all the social media. But to actually establish exactly what is happening, that is where you nearly always have to find a human in the end to verify it. And also, it's interesting that it's much easier, we are much better at verifying things in print than on video. To give you an example, a year ago, there was sadly another terrorist attack in London, in New York on the subway. We were very quick, just purely by surveying social media things and police reports, to establish that this attack had happened. But it was very difficult immediately to verify a picture, a slightly grisly picture that appeared on the web of somebody, allegedly the terrorist, lying in a pool of blood at the subway station. But that gets much more difficult because you know that people can fake pictures terribly easily. So you have to spend time trying to work out whether the subway floor looks like that, whether the number of pixels have been changed. But again, it tends to be moving in the direction of the computer helping us. We don't always get it right, but it's getting much better. Another version of signaling has to do with data. The machine can send us a message to our economics team and say, look, the GDP of Germany relative to that of Greece is now at its lowest level since 2009. Do you want to write a story about that? Or it can point out that the 3 directors of a company in Bangalore have all just sold shares in a company. Do you want to write a story about that? Some of the football data you see on the TV is exactly the same. At the bottom of it, it's effectively saying to the person who's commentating, look, Leicester have now won 3 games in a row, have scored more goals than everybody else. I support Leicester. They will immediately gives the commentator a chance to be able to pick from it. It is the machine that analyzes how far a player runs. It is a machine that tells you how close the ball is to the wicket, and then asks the commentator, in effect, do you want to add anything? In all these cases, I would argue the machine is acting much less like a journalist and more like a commissioning editor. It's saying, how about doing a story on this? That also gives editors a way of holding journalists to account. There's a record showing you were asked that question about a company's share price. Why didn't you write about it? What's your excuse when the takeover is announced? The fourth area in which I think AI could affect what we do will be the issue of personalization. For me, I think this is the holy grail of modern journalism. The idea that you can find a newspaper that is particularly angled towards you. And it is incredibly difficult. And the main reason why is readers. Readers do not like handing over information. They'll fill out a couple of things saying they're quite keen on cricket and they happen to live in Bangalore, but that is about it. The other problem is that, a bit like the old joke about advertising, we know that half our advertising, the old joke about advertising was that somebody knew that half his advertising worked, he just didn't know which half. The same from an editor's point of view is slightly true of journalism at the moment. We know that customers, clients, readers like bits of our journalism, not others. We're just not quite sure what it is. And to make it even harder, the evidence is that people don't like journalism too much if it's solely targeted at them. I'll come back to the idea of ghettos in a second. But it's true, I think, in most of our lives. We don't just want news that we thought was important. We also want to find out that bit at the bottom, that element of serendipity. There was a story this morning about the Russians having equipped a whale with what looks like spying technology and sent it into a harbour in Norway. There is no way that anybody in this room would have ticked a box saying Norway, whale, and Russia. But if you read it, it was interesting, and that element of serendipity is something you need to maintain. At Bloomberg, we have a slight advantage on this because when it comes to companies and things, people will tell us what they're interested in because they want to get the data that they need. So for instance, we now have 50 channels of particular forms of news aimed at particular things called first word channels. And in the morning, we produce something which I would argue is about as close as the first digital newspaper, which is personalized, called Daybreak. And that has one section called Need to Know, which is the big headlines. Modi has done this, Gandhi has done that. And then it has an element of My News, which focuses on particular things that you're interested in. And then finally, it has a Nice to Know element, which is where you discover the stories about whales and Russians or Princess Meghan. So those are the four basic ways in which I think artificial intelligence is changing journalism. Again, I'm not claiming that Bloomberg has a monopoly in any of them, but I do think we're probably as advanced as any people, and I think these things, all these things, are likely to be a big part of your lives in journalism as it goes forward. Before I come back to deal with the issue of fake news, I'll just point out again that big issue. I do not so far see any evidence that these are computers that are taking away people's jobs. They're still very, very important, and all these things, the human side of journalism still matters, and I think it will have to become even cleverer. What do I mean by that? One way of thinking about it is that the world is moving from what to why and what's next. The what of journalism is still incredibly valuable, and by what, I mean what has just happened. If you can tell people that, as we seek to do at Bloomberg particularly, that is still incredibly valuable, but it is incredibly valuable for an ever shorter period of time. If we break the news that one company is due to take over another, it is immensely valuable for between 10 and 15 seconds, because by then the share prices of the two companies have moved. You used my story about the Swiss franc. Even fairly humdrum bits of news now travel all the way around the world almost immediately. So yes, we will continue to invest a lot of money into breaking things on the what side, but we know that they will still be incredibly valuable for shortish periods. And that's why the why and what's next parts of journalism, I think, matter enormously. The more robots help with the more humdrum ends of reporting, the more the value of the human end turns to analysis, to commentary. We think we're breaking more news than anybody else at the moment, but we are investing ever more in commentary. And one reason why is it's very difficult to replace really good commentators with machines. You cannot automate Martin Wolf of the FT. You can't automate the Economist or the Atlantic. And editors also matter, because the danger with machines is spam. They tend to hit people with endless amounts of things. And the real cleverness often of being an editor is knowing what to leave out, what to filter. Virtually everywhere we look at, we see people who will pay a lot, or at least pay something, to get news. But what they do not want is to be completely run over by the amount of information they get. And that, I think, makes a difference not just in terms of editing, but also in terms of formats. We have to get smarter about those too. In the old days, when I began in journalism in 1987, a story always looked pretty much the same. Back then, if you opened the New York Times, say, and I looked at a story on Indira Gandhi, it would be pretty much the same thing. A piece of news, she had just decided to do this or that, and then a degree of explanation about who she was for the people outside India, what the exact state of play in terms of different things, and then at the end, some version of a conclusion. And typically, it would go on for about a quarter of a page of a piece. Now, everything is multiplied. You have blogs, you have videos, you have graphics. But even in print, even in that basic story, that is being broken up. Nowadays, the bit about Indira Gandhi in Congress would now go into some kind of explainer. The reason being that people in India didn't need to have Indira Gandhi explained to them. people outside might need a bit more about the Congress Party, but you can find that by clicking through. Or you could follow an update format where some bits are put into news, other bits are put into explanation. Video, I think, is also splintering. Linear TV with a succession of programs will give way, I think, to much more video on demand in the same way as we go and look at places like Netflix for films, we will increasingly look at it for news as well. And beyond all this, I think, and this is an element of hope, at least from my end, I think we are catering to readers and viewers who are normally more short of time than they are of money. And the reason is that today, the sort of ideas and the information that journalism, good journalism, can put across is still worth something. The Economist, I think, the most expensive magazine in the world, but used to continually point out that it was only a cappuccino a week. That is not a lot for the kind of information you have. Even at Bloomberg, where on our consumer side, it is not much more than that. I think it matters, and you can see it in the way that young people are picking up things like Spotify and Netflix, that people are prepared to pay for information, for content when they can. But they do not want to have their time wasted. And so that's one reason why formats have to get tighter. And in general, the trend is towards shorter, quicker bits of journalism. But not always. I would submit to you that if you want to understand the Indian election, you could watch maybe 25 videos, you could look at a variety of different data graphics, you could read a lot of what we call blasts or quick things this way or that, but you might be much better sitting down to read one long piece in Business Week or New Yorker. Not necessarily because the writing would be superior, but because it would save you time. It would be more time efficient for you to sit and read one piece than all those many shorter ones. So for all those reasons, I think that some strands of journalism are going to survive, and the others will live very happily on top of what computers do. So that brings me to the second part. You might say, okay, that's fine. I understand that we still need human journalists, so we will get more news, but what about fake news? Won't AI make it easier to fool us? And I think there is a lot of truth in that. We all remember the cyber-utopianism of the 1990s when people dreamt about citizen journalism making us all purer. And that went the same way as all those dreams that it was possible to make news for free. Now we know that the same technology that was used to democratize the world can also be used to suppress dissent. China is ahead of us, rather notably in some versions of AI, such as face recognition technology. And yes, it is possible, as we've seen, for bad people to use this technology to fool people, not least in journalism. If Robert Mueller was correct about Russia, it was possible to help fix the last American election from a Moscow office building for a cost of $1 million a month. And you can also herd readers and viewers into the same ghetto of opinion. So you only hear the sort of news you want to hear. I think there are three basic types of fake news. The first is state-sponsored fake news. This is the world of Vladimir Putin. You use bots and other gizmos to spread untrue rumors or just deny the truth. This version of fake news has changed in quite an interesting way. In the old days, what would happen is that something would happen, and then rather than, you would simply deny that, for instance, the separatists in Ukraine had shot down an airline with what looks like a Russian missile. You would simply deny it once and move on. Nowadays, the way that fake news is done is you spread hundreds of different rumors in hundreds of different places. And you keep on, as often as possible, trying to not establish that there is one truth. That is the way that states, on the whole, do it. Next, I would argue, comes moronic news. This is where somebody comes up with some particularly weird or wonderful idea that Pakistan has captured 50 Indian soldiers, or that Hillary Clinton is having an affair with Imran Khan. And they broadcast it. And then the state, what happens is sometimes the bad states pick it up and push it through. Finally, and most complicated, there is commentary that one sort of people think is fine, and the other group think is fake news. And this, I think, is the most difficult area, and is one where I take a fairly fundamentalist attitude, is that commentary is commentary, and you should accept it even when you disagree with it. In America, I often find myself arguing with people who talk a lot about the birth of Fox News as being something that was different and conservative. But for many people on the right in America, Fox News was giving them a form of commentary they hadn't had before, and so it does not surprise me they picked up on it. It's also worth noting, among the many people who claim that Fox has always been on Trump's side, that to begin with at least, by far the toughest interviewing of Trump came from the conservative wing. You think of the Megyn Kelly interview. What about the charge of ghettos? Here again, I think that we have to be overly simplistic. I know in India it is a difficult one and I haven't yet seen data on it. If you look at America, people tend to say, yes, there are two sorts of ghetto. There's a ghetto on the right, where people watch Fox, they listen to Rush Limbaugh, and they read the Wall Street Journal. On the left, you have a group of people who watch MSNBC, listen to NPR, and read the New York Times. And the evidence academically is, well, yes, there are a few people like that, but most people still want as part of their media diet something else. And what is particularly attractive to me is the idea most of the conservatives I've met spend a large amount of their time reading liberal media, such as the British Guardian, in order to discover what their enemy does. And the same token, people go the other way. I accept here it's a little bit more different, but in general, I think the idea of ghettos has been exaggerated. So I think these are all ways in which bad news machines will come up ways to manipulate good machines, and they will be there and we have to live with them. But I think there are several points in our favour as to why we will win in the end. The first is the victories so far have made us much more vigilant. You only have to look at the way that anything to do with American journalism now, American elections now, is now policed and now questioned. And don't forget all the different ways in which AI will help journalists be able to check things. You can scour the Panama Papers in seconds. You can check whether the picture on the right really is Donald Trump, or really is a picture of a bombing in Pakistan. And it will help us on the whole disseminate news. The line on the Washington Post that democracy dies in darkness, I think is true, but AI helps us shine light by getting more news to more people. It is harder in general, not always in particular, it is harder in general for bad people to hide. And in the end, go back to what I said at the beginning. Fake news did not begin with the internet. Humans have always found ways to manipulate humans. The Trojan horse was arguably the original piece of fake news, that you could say it was the garden and the apple in the Garden of Eden. If you go back to ancient Rome, Octavian poisoned the minds of the people of Rome about Antony by publishing a fake will that showed he was leaving all his money to Egypt. Shakespeare made a very convenient villain out of Richard III. There's a nice way of looking back at the way there was really no golden age where all journalism was fine and unrestricted. The very first newspaper in India, James Hickey's Bengal Gazette, I was reading about it this morning, that was set up to expose the horrors and the evils of the East India Company, and he inevitably ended up in prison rather quickly. But it was not as if then that there weren't people trying to push back. Mahatma Gandhi had a very nice line about English newspapers. He said, to the English voter, their newspaper is their Bible. And then he said, they take their cue from newspapers that are always dishonest. The point is that at many times, newspapers being used in good and bad ways. And I think if you look at India at the moment, yes, there are some things, some areas where I see fake news being spread by new technology. I can see it with WhatsApp, with the way that people try to persuade people that one group or other is deeply wrong. But I don't think you need to go all the way to the internet to find examples of things that are wrong. If you want one, just open any newspaper in India and look for a map. You are surrounded in this country by countries that are less democratic than you are. China, Pakistan, Russia, all these ones. I've dealt with all of them. They have many faults, but the one thing they have never insisted is that we draw a border where it doesn't physically exist. And that is something that India sadly does. Only India produces fake geography. It is fine always to show the lines where people claim particular areas. That is part of it. But it is also a journalist's job, I would submit, to say where the border, for better or worse, currently exists. And that is something that I hope the people in this room will help change in Indian journalism. I would also submit that there was nothing particularly digital about the ouster of my friend and colleague Bobby Ghosh, who now works for us from the Hindustan Times. I think, again, that is something that goes back to an older thing than anything to do with technology or newness. Nor is it particularly to do with one party exerting control over the media. You can see that on the other side with what happens in Calcutta. In short, the same things are being used against journalists everywhere. It has not changed, and it will not change. And the job of many in this room will be to fight that and to push back. Journalism has always been interrupted by technology. In 1840, the Times of London started using a steam-powered press that effectively raised the amount of papers you could print tenfold. Cheap newspapers, many of them scandalous, sprouted everywhere. The biggest was Benjamin Day's New York Sun, which sold for a penny. It specialized in extravagant fake news. It reported that half bat, half humans were living on the moon. When people questioned Day, he said, "Prove me wrong." But gradually the tide turned, and it turned for two reasons, or three. One was the number of people, like hopefully the people in this room, who wanted to be good journalists to change it. The second was advertisers, who thought they no longer wanted to have their soap and their various other products advertised alongside the pictures of the half bats, half human. And the last was readers, who said, "I will pay for good news." And I think we are getting that respect. What you do, and here I'm addressing the students we're about to see, is important. India, I think, needs good journalists. It needs the facts, so do powerful people, and it needs investigative journalism, regardless of what the people in power think. So go out there, I think, and explain the facts. I think follow the line of James Hickey, no matter how difficult it was, and be brutally honest with people, not least with yourselves, when it comes to your experiments with truth. I'll end with a quotation from Gandhi himself. He said, "In the very first month of India Opinion, I realized that the sole aim of journalism should be service. The press is a great power, but just as an untrained torrent of water submerges the whole countryside and devastates crops, even so an uneducated pen serves but to destroy." I think you have an immense responsibility, and it is one that sometimes you will not get completely right. Sometimes you will get things wrong. That is in the nature of journalism in itself. But as long as you strive for the sort of independent, investigative ether that you see in many places up on the screen, you will do very well. Thank you very much.